Welcome back to the Painting Coach, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be having a look at how I thin my paint, so hopefully it's something you find really useful, hopefully it's something you find that helps. And what I'd really love to know is if you do enjoy it, is there any other tips or techniques you'd love to see me do? So we're not going to actually paint a model today, we're just going to look at some of the basics and principles behind thinning paint. I'm going to ramble on a little bit, and I really hope you like it. So I'll see you on the other side of this. Okay, so when we talk about thinning our paints for miniatures, this is how I do it, this is what works for me. So really it's just me going to share some insights, some models that I'm working on as part of my personal collections for friends and things like that. Now, when it comes to thinning your paints, there's absolutely not one right way. And the reason for that can be seen as simply as the fact that this is a Citadel base paint, this is a Citadel layer paint. So this paint has more pigment than this paint. So you may want to thin this one a little bit more than you would with this one. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's different pigments, different formula in all paints from all manufacturers. Similarly, we can have exactly the same pot of paint from exactly the same manufacturer made on exactly the same day. But because mine's been open and shut, and you've never opened yours, your paint will still be the consistency it was at the factory, whereas mine will have degraded quite a bit. So there's all these different things to consider. So if people ask me, can you tell me how to thin my paints? No, I can't, but what I can do is show you how I thin mine and the reason I thin them like that. So that's what this video is all about. That's what we're going to jump into next. We'll start off with base coating. The first thing to say about my palette, obviously I'm using a wet palette here. Now this is the Redgrass Games Stay Wet palette. This is the XL version, so it's a really nice kind of big palette that I can use to get plenty of paint on. Probably use about half of these, or half a pallet's worth of paint when I'm doing a painting tutorial. So when it comes to base coat then, let's look at how I like to thin my paint down for that. So I'm just going to take some Mephiston Red here, and people have asked me how I get it from the pot onto the palette. Give it a good shake, then just scoop some out that top bit there and apply it to the palette like that. And then what I'm going to do is just a tiny dip of water, just to help it flow a little. Now that's the kind of consistency that I want for a base colour. In terms of how I apply that to the model, just take this Stormcast catapult here, just get some on your brush and just apply that nice and smoothly over the model. And you can see that actually that kind of covers pretty well in just one coat. On larger areas it may not cover quite so easily, but once you've got that first one dry you can go on and do the second one. So for me, that's a nice kind of consistency for a base coat. Now, one of the good things with a wet palette, obviously it keeps your paint wet for longer, keeps it hydrated, because essentially what happens, this paper lets the water come through and it keeps that paint hydrated. Now, the other thing you can do if you're not 100% sure is if I take my brush and I just pull it through the paint like this, you can see there that we're getting a much thinner paint as we go down. Now that's not necessarily because the paint itself is any less pigmented. It's just so that if I want to go on that and I want some really thin Mephiston Red, then I can take it from this part rather than this part, which is much thicker. I can take it from the bottom half. So the other good thing about a wet palette is you don't need to add too much water to your paint. So that's how I'd go about base coating. Let's look at how much we want to thin the paint down for doing some layering next. I'm going to stick with the red scheme for now, or the red theme, and just pop some Evil Sun Scarlet onto the palette. Now, when it comes to layering, we're essentially covering whole areas. And I'm going to do this pretty much the same way as I did the Mephiston Red, just with a small amount of water. And you just mix that in, and you can see that I've got much more paint there now than I did before. So again, if I take my brush and I pull it through, you can see that I can get exactly the same effect. So if I want it to be different thicknesses, then that's fine. But essentially, if I'm layering on something, I don't want to worry about these other thicknesses here. What I want to do is be able to get a nice good layer on a model. So if I come back to this catapult, I want to take it again from this top end, make sure I haven't got too much on my brush. I just want to layer it over like that. And you can see that that actually covers pretty well. When I come to the larger area here, you can see that it doesn't quite cover as nicely, so I'm probably going to need a couple of coats. And you can see there's probably a bit too much water in there, so that could be for any reason. It could be that I've just not dried my brush enough, it could be that I've put a little bit much in, but when it comes to that, if I move on to a different model and just rotate the palette slightly, see I've got a Primaris Tech Marine there, which is a fantastically wonderful model. Again, what I'm going to look to do is just take the paint from here and then just layer it on like that, nice and simple. Of course, I'll go back and tidy this up when I'm actually painting it for real. This is just a project that I've got on the side here, but again, you're just using the paint from this part of the palette, getting it all over your brush so that you've got a good amount on there, but not too much. And then when it comes to the model itself, just making nice strokes to make sure that you cover it nicely. And then when that dries, you'll get a nice layer there. So that's base coating done, that's layering done in terms of the thickness, and I hope you can kind of see that there, how the wet palette gives you a nice opportunity to just use single layers that blend into the layers underneath, and then you can go back in just to build that vibrancy up. We'll have a look at highlighting next. So when it comes to line highlighting, I guess you've got one of the tougher choices to make in terms of your paint and how much you thin it down and dilute it. So I'm going to just move to some Mechanicus standard grey here, and I haven't lost my head. I'm not going to use this to highlight the red, but that's basically straight out of the pot. Now if I take my brush and work it through, you can see there, as I move my brush, it kind of catches. So that's probably a little too thick for what we want when it comes to a line highlight. So what I'm just going to do is, again, I'm just going to take a little spot of water, and I'm looking for that kind of consistency, because that just gives it a little bit extra flow. So if I do the same thing with my brush again, excuse me, you can see there that it just flows a little better off the brush, ever so slightly, and those lines tell me that my brushes are dirty and I need to clean them. But in terms of how we look to apply that on a model, if I again just kind of take some paint from the back, which is where it's thickest, in terms of applying it to this Raven Guard model just on the gun, just taking the tip of the brush and running it along those edges gives you a really nice sharp line highlight that is difficult to achieve if you're trying to paint along those edges. So I just want to make sure that he stays in focus so you can see how I'm doing that. And there straight away you've got a nice sharp line highlight with that kind of dilution. Now I'd love to stand you or sit you rather and say, look, I use X amount of water for this particular paint, and you may have heard that, oh, you know, you want your paint the consistency of skimmed milk. Well, I'm sure whichever country you live in the world, skim milk has probably got a different consistency, and I think when it comes to paint, experience does help and it does play a part. Like I said, I can't tell you exactly how to thin your paint, but what I can tell you is what works for me. So that's kind of highlighting covered. Let's have a little look at metallics next. So on the palette for this, we've got some Retributor Armour and we've got some Lead Belcher. Now I've not put any water in them, they're not thinned down at all, and I just want to kind of show you how they work across the palette. So again, if we take that Retributor armour first, you can see we get exactly the same effect with the paint as we do with the other normal paint. And then with the lead belcher, it's a little bit thinner, but essentially the same effect again. Now, some people say don't use metallics on a wet palette. I can't say I've ever had any issue doing that. That being said, you do just need to be a little careful about the thickness of some of the things you do. So if I have a look at this Citra Battle Can Nest, if I want to base the lead belcher, I'm kind of taking it from the top here, which is kind of the thicker part of it. I'm just going to run this across the sword from a distance. You can see that it covers pretty well there, like that, and it doesn't cover up any detail. It's pretty good. You know, that's a decent bit of coverage for silver. So I'll just finish this very quickly so that we can get it done. And then I'll show you the gold. So again, that coverage is nice, it's neat. You're not running the risk of having it too thick on there. So with the gold, first off, let me show you what happens if you use maybe something from a little bit lower down here, which is a little bit thinner. So if we look at the hilt, we use that gold from lower down, which is a little bit thinner, you can see it doesn't cover quite as well. Which is okay, because you can just go in for a second coat to get that done. If I flip it round, and then we make sure our brush is dry, we take something from kind of the thicker side up at the top there. When it comes to painting the hilt, we can see that actually this covers a lot better, and we can get away with one, maybe two coats where it doesn't quite cover the best. And that, in a nutshell, is the difference when I'm base coating with metallic. So if I put the model down, just rotate the palette so you can see a little better. If you're base coating, you want to go with the slightly thicker, but I guess the key thing is to make sure you haven't got too much on your brush. Now, in everything you've seen me do, you've seen me load the brush like that, but you've seen me move it around and just load the tip of the brush just like that. I've not gone wild. I don't address the model with a brush full of paint like that, because if I address the model with a brush full of paint like that, it's going to get quite messy. So if I took this model and then started, yes, it covers, but actually my paint is really thick, so I might be covering up detail. I'm having to slop it on a bit. I can't be very smooth, so I'm going to damage my brush. It's just all in all not the way to do things, because we're going to have to go in and fix that anyway. So you might as well do it right from the first part, and then you'll get a much nicer, better finish. So that's metallics done. We'll do contrast paints next. Now, for contrast paints, you can use them in a number of ways. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I love to use them for glow effects, for doing things like glazes, etc., because they're really easy to use for that kind of thing. So I'm going to show you this couple of Anvil Industry 3D printed models here from, I think it was last month's Patreon campaign. So these are kind of drop troops. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to use contrast paint two ways, thinned and not thinned. So first off, this is coming straight from the pot. So you can see I've got a brush full there. I'm just going to paint this straight over the model. Now this model is Death Guard green spray, and then it's had wreath bone from kind of 45 degrees to give a kind of a zenithal effect. So you can see there, with it straight out of the pot, it covers nicely. We're just going to work it all the way around. Let it dry. So I'll just do the legs, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the other way you can use it. Just work our way around there. These are lovely little models, by the way. I've not had anything off Anvil Industry before. I saw these advertised and I thought, with the 3D printer, let's get some and see what happens. And actually, really great models. Do the helmet as well, because I've spilled onto that. So this is the one. This is straight from the pot. So you can see actually managing to control this fairly well. It's not too bad at all. So that's straight from the pot. We'll kind of let that dry off to the side, but actually that's a really nice effect, especially with that kind of zenithal that we've got on the priming of the model. It just makes everything else much easier. The other way you can do it, so I've got another one of those models. And the other thing that's good with this is got a mix of male and female. So if I just bring the palette in a little bit, pop the Militarum green down, wash my brush off. You can then use it for any number of things. So look how thin you can get that paint. So if you want to use glazes with contrast paint, absolutely perfect for it. But if I just focus on the back side here, putting that on, you can see straight away it's not as thick. So if you want to build your contrast colours up with a nice smooth kind of transition, then this might be something that you look into. Obviously this is going to take you a lot longer to paint it than it took me to do the first guy. But don't remember, I've not thinned this paint at all. So I've not put any contrast medium in it. I've not put any water in it. I've literally put it on the wet palette, and then I've let the wet palette do its job. So the water within the palette is hydrating the model. And that's giving you that that finish there. So if we compare the two of them, you'll see it's actually quite stark. So you can see the one of them has got, the first one I did is much darker, much greener. You could probably be happy with that as one coat, whereas the second one is a lot more subtle, and you'd perhaps need another coat or two just to add to it, unless you want to go for that really pale kind of military type green. So that's contrast paints. We'll have a little look at washes as the last thing, and then we'll wrap this video up. So when I use washes, I tend to use them exactly the same way that I just showed you contrast paint. So if I want to shade these legs with green, I've just taken some Biel-Tan green shade here and painting it all over exactly like I would with those contrast paints. And you can see that obviously the green is a different colour. It's a lot thinner than perhaps the contrast paint is automatically out the bag. And now I probably use Null Oil, Agrax Earthshade, Reikland Flesh Shade on the majority of the models I use. They're ubiquitous paints, they're fantastic, they work with pretty much all the colours I tend to use. So that's the green straight out of the pot. Well, what does that look like if I put it on the palette? So if I just put some on the palette there using the same brush, you can see that I've got exactly the same thing going. So if I wanted to create a glaze, all I've got to do is take some of that from kind of this area, and then I can look to just add it to that pad. And you can see there's hardly any wash coming off at all. So it's a little nice effect. Even when I put more of it on, you can see it's very different and works very different to how it works on that leg there, for example. So if I just do that pad there, you can see it's a very different effect. And again, you can do that just to subtly change the colour of things if you want to make things dirtier. That's the way. So that's the end of the video. Let's just kind of wrap things up really quickly and go through some last steps. So here's my palette. For base coating, you kind of want to use the top end, and when it comes to thinning paints down with a wet palette, it's just a little smidge of water. You don't want to put too much on, because if you put too much water, if I take the gold here as an example, if I fill it up with too much water, look how that reacts, and then watch the paint change, because that gold is now far too thin. So that's too thin to paint on anything, and it started to separate a little bit. So if I play with it with my paintbrush, you can see there, look how thin that is, and look, you've got no control over that. It's almost like a wash, almost like a gold wash, because that's far too thin. So it's just about being really careful with some of the choices you make and the amount of water you add. If you're base coating or layering, you want to go with these kind of top areas there. For the line highlight and the edge highlighting, you want your paint to be a little bit thinner because you want it to flow off your brush, but you don't want it so wet that it flows off uncontrollably and ends up a little bit like that mess you've got there. And then for contrast and washes, again the same. You can either go straight from the pot, which I do most of the time. It's only if I'm using them for glazes that I actually apply them to the palette. The other times I go straight from the pot. And then again, if you want to make glazes out of these colours, you can, just to add a little bit of pop to a miniature. So that's the end of the video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I've just tried to go through how I thin my paints, and hopefully it gives you some insight into how you can do yours. I would encourage you to try different things. Different brands work completely differently as well. So just whatever brand paint you're using at the moment, just have a play around. And it's really good to get either like an old model or a bit of sprue, some bases, paint them up and have a play around with the thickness of the paint, because it really will help you. And if you really want to kick yourself on, I would say get yourself a wet palette. You'll be really surprised. Thanks again for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please leave a like and a comment down below. If you want to help support me, you can do with my Patreon, where you get exclusive access to me, as well as monthly question and answers and exclusive content, a little bit like this. You can also use the links in the description with Goblin Gaming. You can get up to 20% off all your gaming needs. And you can also see my Amazon recommended items, which again, everything goes to help the channel out, but it doesn't actually cost you anything additional. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.